Hello, friends, and thank you for joining me on the Finding Elevation podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Thompson. I am a mountaineer. I've coached hundreds of aspiring mountain athletes to reach their goals. I also am the author of the book, Finding Elevation, Fear and Courage on the World's Most Dangerous Mountain. And I am super passionate about learning and growing through adventurous pursuits. That's why this podcast is dedicated to encouraging, uplifting, inspiring, and educating people like yourself who aspire to elevate their lives through the outdoors. So let's get into it. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm excited for today's episode because we are going to Mount Everest. So there have been a billion things written and filmed about climbing the world's highest mountain, of course. So I'm not going to get into like the nitty gritty specific day-to-day things. We are going to talk about fitness, of course. And then I'm going to share just some sort of tips and learnings that I've had along the way, as have my clients, and share those so that hopefully if you're headed to Everest, which expeditions will start in a couple of months, you've got a little extra support, a little extra knowledge, a little extra information to help your trip to the Himalaya go smoothly. So I want to start, as we always do, with a little bit of history because I think history is cool. Everest, of course, is a part of the Himalayan mountain range. That range sits on the border between Nepal and Tibet. And there are two local names for the mountain. So we call it Mount Everest. It was named after Sir George Everest, who was a surveyor. He's probably overseeing the survey of Mount Everest, and so that's why it was named after him. But in Tibet, the local name is Chomolungma, and that means goddess mother of the world, which I love. When I think of Mount Everest, that's sort of the persona that I give that peak. And then the Nepali name is Sagarmatha, and that means goddess of the sky. So two very beautiful names for the world's highest mountain. There were many early attempts, of course, to reach the summit. This is back in, the 1920s when people were climbing for their countries in order to stake their country's flag on the highest point on Earth. Most of those expeditions were British expeditions. So the first one was in 1921, and they got alarmingly, if you think about the kind of clothes and equipment that they must have had in 1921, they got pretty high. They got to about 20,000 feet. This is on the north side. And a part of that expedition was George Mallory. We'll talk more about him in a little bit. But as I was sort of researching this, one of the staggering things that stood out to me was that this climbing team, which was enormous, they had to walk 300 miles, 300 miles just to get to Mount Everest. And then they started climbing. And of course, this was a big entourage of, mules and later on yaks and porters. And they had all kinds of provisions like typewriters that, today seem outrageous. So that was one of the early expeditions. And so they didn't summit. Then there were others in the 20s and 30s, but it wasn't until 1953, when the first confirmed summit of Everest happened. And we'll talk a little bit about why I use that language in a second. And that was made, of course, by Tenzing Norgay and Sir Edmund Hillary, a New Zealander. There's some controversy around that because George Mallory went back in 1924 with Sandy Irvine. This was a part of another British expedition. And they were chosen to reach the summit out of the whole team. And they were last spotted through a scope near the summit. And then they were never seen again. So if you sort of follow Everest history, you'll probably know that George Mallory's body was pretty recently found. It was in 1999 that some climbers found his body, but there was no evidence anywhere that he had summited. And so his partner, Sandy Irvine, and his camera have never been found. So there's been a lot of expeditions. I mean, you can imagine what the photos on that camera are worth if someone wants to find it and then, of course, sell it to a news outlet, and also just to set the record straight about who really was the first human to set foot on the highest mountain on Earth. So Sandy's body's not been found. His camera has not been found. And then, people have dug into this a lot. The other thing that hasn't been found is a letter and a picture that Mallory carried with him. And he said that he would leave both of those things on the summit. But when they found his body, neither the letter nor the picture were there. So there's still some speculation and some intrigue and mystery surrounding the first Everest summit. There's a great book that's been written recently about a recent expedition whose mission was to find Sandy Irvine's body and camera. It's written by Mark Sinott, who was on that expedition. It's called The Third Pole, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes. But a lot of mountaineers and people who've spent a lot of time in the Himalaya think that Mallory and Irvine did summit, but there's still some speculation. There's no proof. And then digging a little bit deeper, because I just find this fascinating. So if people who think that they did summit think that they wouldn't have been able to down climb the second step, which is one of the most difficult features on the route on the Tibetan side of the mountain, because there wouldn't have been any fixed ropes or pitons or picket in that particular spot. And there wasn't a great rock outcropping that would be a natural anchor for them that they could have wrapped a rope around in order to rappel that section. People speculate that they fell there. Some people also think that they made it past that there's a sequence of moves that they could have possibly followed in order to get down the second step, but then they took the wrong set of gullies to descend further and fell. So we don't know. I hope in my lifetime somebody figures it out, because it would just be a really cool piece of history. So that's sort of the controversy about the first summit. The first female summit of Everest was in 1975 by a Japanese woman named Junko Tabei, who's an amazing, so accomplished for her time, for any time really, female climber. And then more recently, the first female ascent without oxygen is by my hero, Melissa Arnott-Reed. In 2016, she summited without O's from the north side. That was the year that I summited with lots of oxygen from the south side. So a little bit of history, which is always important, I think. As I've sort of alluded to, there are two primary routes that people climb on Everest. One is on the north side, the Tibetan side. That's the Northwest Ridge. And then the second, which is far, far, far more popular for a few reasons that we'll talk about, is from the Nepali side or the south side. And it's a wide margin of people that summit from the south Nepali side as compared to the north side. But there are something like 15 or 18 confirmed routes on Everest. These are just the two most popular. And when most people say they climbed Everest, they're talking about climbing it from the south side. So some of the pros and cons, if you're thinking about, which side to attempt if there's an Everest summit in your future, the south side really is a beautiful trek through the Khumbu Valley in Nepal. You're staying at tea houses that are owned by the local Nepalese, and you're getting to know, during this 7 or so day walk to base camp, you're getting to know their families and their food and their customs. And it's really, for me, it's really a very peaceful way to sort of ease into this huge task of climbing the world's highest mountain. On the south side as well, there's lots and lots, we could argue too many commercial helicopter companies that will rescue you from very high on the mountain if that becomes necessary. And because it's the south side of the mountain, it's a little bit warmer and often less windy than the north side. Things I think that make the south side a bit challenging are, of course, the Khumbu Icefall, which you must climb a few times. And that's, as the Khumbu Glacier slides down the side of Mount Everest, there's a point in the geography where it gets pinched. And that pinching causes the glacier to sort of break up and almost crumble. And so that creates this ice fall, and it's constantly shifting. Every day it moves a couple of feet, and getting through that is, of course, very treacherous. And, if there were an easier way, of course, we wouldn't climb through the ice fall. So that's a downside, I think. And crowds, we've all seen the pictures recently, which sort of break my heart a little bit to just see, lines and lines of people all headed for the summit at the same time, because, of how many people are on the mountain, and then there being just a narrow summit window where everyone who's in position wants to attempt the summit. So crowds are something to consider for sure if you're thinking about summiting from the south side. And then the summit night is a little bit longer on the south side. But On the north side, way fewer crowds by far. You can actually drive to base camp. So you can take a Jeep there, sort of bring anything you want because you're driving by vehicle to get there. Your summit night will be a little bit shorter as well. The research I've done, I think that the climbing is tougher on the north side. It's definitely colder and in general windier. Camps are at higher elevations, which is, I think probably better because you get to acclimatize better. But the climbing, I think, is tougher. And there's not the, plethora of commercial helicopter organizations that will rescue you on the north side. So some things to consider, certainly do your research, but those are sort of the high points. And then in terms of technical skill, I think they both require a combination of technical climbing skills and high altitude experience. The North Col or the Tibetan side of the mountain, I think you'll feel better on that ascent if you've got more technical rock and ice climbing experience. While on the south side, it's really the ice fall that's the most technically challenging part of that climb. And I say that because I believe, and a lot of other people do too, that the Hillary Step fell off in the 2015 earthquake. And that was a big technically demanding feature on the south side that climbers would have to climb over on summit day. So I was there in 2016. There was, at that point, everyone was sort of speculating, like, is it still here? Is it not? And as I've sort of followed in the more recent years, I think it crumbled during that earthquake. So that makes your summit a little bit easier. And I think the south side is a little bit technically less demanding. I'll also add that my view is that you should have at least attempted another 8,000 meter peak before you head to Everest. That's not required in order to get a permit from the Nepali government. A lot of guide companies do require that you've tried an 8,000 meter peak first. I just think that there is so much that you learn when you're on a Himalayan expedition about coping and being away from home and living in an inhospitable environment and, working with a diverse team of people you may not know. And I think that your level of mental toughness and how your body responds are also important things to hone in and to understand. And I think that you need to have those things sorted out as well as you can before you head to Everest. So my recommendation is to climb something else like Manaslu first, just to see how it goes and get those things like sorted out, get your gear ironed out before you attempt Everest. So as I said, so much has been written about climbing Everest and sort of the day to day and what that's like. So I'm not going to spend the time that we have really digging into that. But I do want to start about preparation and share some tips and learnings from my time in the Himalayas as well as from the clients that I've coached. So let's start with physical preparation. You just have to be in the best shape of your life before you go to Everest. I think that it's disrespectful to the mountain, in fact, to any mountain, not to be in shape and ready and prepared for what the demands of that mountain are going to ask of you. So please start a year ahead. And that doesn't mean it has to be intense training, but it could be a really slow ramp up of doing a lot of zone 2 cardio, which will serve you incredibly well on Everest. Start a year ahead. Please don't start 3 months ahead because unless, you've got a tremendous background as a climber and as an endurance athlete, you're just not going to be ready in time and you're not going to have as good of a time on the mountain as you could have if you'd spent the time to prepare. So the first phase of training is just like training for any big mountain. We'll focus on cardiovascular capacity. And I like for that to be a 3 or 4 month effort for people. You can't do too much of that work. As long as you're avoiding injury, you can't do too much of that zone 2 cardio as an endurance athlete. It's just always going to serve you well, always going to create this really deep pool of cardiovascular capacity that you can draw on day after day when you're in the mountains. So get that set. And as a coach, I'm totally cool if someone comes to me and they've done that on their own and we talk about what that has looked like for the past 3 or 4 months. And then I help them like dig into the specifics and like tweaking exactly what they need to do for Everest. So as as the dollar signs are escalating for what this climb is going to cost you, that's maybe something that you could do on your own and then work with a coach like myself to tweak those last few months that you need for prepping for Everest. But once you have that really solid cardiovascular base in place, then you'll want to start building some strength that's specific to the mountain. And so I always think about what are the demands? What are the physical strength-based demands that a particular mountain is going to ask of a climber? And on Everest, it's largely like, this is by no means meant to make it sound simple or easy, but you're mostly walking, like the motion, if you break it down to the mechanics of how your body is moving, it's mostly the same motion of walking. Granted, it's very steep, but there's not a lot of sort of hand over hand climbing movement. So you really need to make sure that your lower body and core are super, super strong and ready for day after day, living at elevation and moving efficiently on the mountains. I like to include some upper body work there because you will also be on a fixed line nearly the whole time. And while you don't want to be yanking on that fixed line, there is an element of, there are times when there's some pressure there, some tension, and let's just be honest, we've all pulled on it once or twice. And so you need to have good upper body strength and endurance for that. And then finally, the last step is to really focus on building endurance in the specific muscle systems that you'll rely on to propel you up and down that mountain, as well as your cardiovascular endurance. And yes, you can train for Everest if you live in Florida or another elevation challenged part of the world. I've coached many people who've done that. We just have to be a little bit more creative about what you have access to and how we design your training plan. And you'll probably become really good friends with all the equipment at your local gym. I get asked often, so that's sort of like basic physical prep. I also get asked often about incorporating hypoxic training into training plans for big mountains. And I'm actually sitting in my hypoxic tent as I'm recording this. So I'm obviously a proponent of it. And I think it works. I think that you have to be very mindful, though, about how you use it. Because when you're training for a big mountain, you're taxing your body and your mind to a very high level. And recovery is absolutely critical to ensure that you can continue training at a high rate. And we recover the most when we sleep. So if you're sleeping in a hypoxic environment, you're probably not getting the best sleep. And so you have to be really mindful and I think honest too about when you wake up in the morning, what are your saturations, setting thresholds, below which you'll not allow your saturation to drop, and assessing how you feel, and then, cranking it back or taking a day off of the hypoxic training if that's what your body's telling you need. There's also different, forms of hypoxic training. I'm doing sort of passive training now. I'm just, sitting at my desk, breathing slightly hypoxic air. There's also more focused passive training where you just sit on the couch, you're watching TV and you wear the mask for a certain period of time and then you take it off. So it's intermittent passive hypoxic training. And then you can, of course, walk on a treadmill while wearing a mask that's allowing you to breathe hypoxic air. And so most people do some combination of all of those things and sort of find something that works best for them and their work environment, their travel schedule, all of that. I do think that it is beneficial. I have looked into the science. I've measured my red blood cell count before using a hypoxic training protocol and after, and have seen the difference in red blood cell count that it makes. It's important to understand, though, that the hypoxic generator, in fact, none of them will simulate the decrease in pressure that occurs when you're climbing at elevation. And that is one thing that often will cause edema, which is something, of course, cerebral or pulmonary edema will end your climb for sure. So it's not an exact match of, I slept in the tent at 16,000 feet. And so that's exactly the same as being at 16,000 feet in the mountains. It's not quite like that. But training / sleeping in a hypoxic environment will cause, its EPO I think it's a hormone that causes your body to produce more red blood cells. That process will kick in when you're training and sleeping in a hypoxic environment. It won't be an exact match as to what it's like to be at elevation. So that's my little thought to note about hypoxic training. And then, of course, I want to make a quick mention of mental prep. The last episode was totally dedicated to that topic, so I'm not going to dig too deeply in here again because you've all heard me talk about it already. But it's so critical that you build the mental resilience before you go to Everest or any big peak so that you're able to overcome the challenges of climbing at that elevation, in that environment. And that includes, tough days in the mountains before you go, building that mental strength sort of in as close of a, simulated environment as you can, as well as, visualizations, mantras, thinking about what worries you, all of those tools. Like, now is the time to pull them out and to make sure that you're as tough mentally as you can possibly be. I've heard someone say, and I think this is probably pretty accurate, that above 23,000 feet, every climb is mental. It doesn't matter anymore how many squats you did. It's about being tough mentally because your body is deteriorating. It's, you're losing muscle. It's in a stressed environment. It's suboptimal for sure. And so having a really strong mind and a lot of resilience, I think, is what separates people who summit from people who don't. So let's talk a little bit about some of those details that I think really help people prepare for a big climb like Everest and take, obviously what works for you. And I would say you could apply these to other peaks as well. So I think it's very important. I am laughing because I was talking to a client a week ago who hadn't yet told his family that he was climbing Everest, but he was already training for it. So have the conversation with your family, with your loved ones, with your boss, whoever, so that they understand what you're all signing up for. And I do mean everybody, because it's not just the climber that's involved in this project to climb to the highest peak in the world. It's everyone around them is going to have to lend support or patience or some sort of resource at some time during the, year-long preparation and then 3-month climb. So be sure that everyone's on board for that. And be sure that, your partner in particular understands that there are going to be times in the next year that you're going to be pretty myopic, focused on this goal, and that you need to be in order to be prepared and stay safe on that mountain. And be sure you have the support from the people that are important to you in order to do that. I think it's also a good idea, like the last month of preparation, just to make sure that the people around you really know that things are going to be crazy and that your primary goal is probably going to be preparing for this mountain. It's good, as I said, to get that support and to sort of lay that groundwork ahead of time. My second tip is to know your why. We've talked about this in the past as well. And it's okay. I want to relieve a little bit of pressure. I heard from people like, I don't know what my why is. And I think it's okay if your why is just to climb the highest mountain in the world. That's okay. It doesn't have to be this really sort of, deep, personal improvement sort of goal. It's just important that you know why it's important to you. And we talked about some techniques in the very first episode for getting to that point, but make sure know why you're committing this much time, this much money, this much, brain power, this much physical effort into climbing this mountain. You should know what that is. I am also, third tip, a huge fan of watching videos before a climb. And even I do this today. If I'm getting ready to climb in Ecuador in a couple of weeks, I haven't been there before. And so I'm, watching videos on YouTube from other climbers who have been there. And for Everest especially, there are a lot of dramatic videos and movies about climbing that peak. So look for ones that are informative as opposed to dramatic. And definitely don't let your friends or your family watch the dramatic ones, but study them. And this is a good thing to do if you're spending hours on a treadmill or the bike preparing. Watch these videos because I think it gives you motivation to get through those long gym-based workouts. but look at the route, the weather, what people are wearing, what they're eating, what they're talking about being problems, what they're talking about that's worrying them. And think about those things relative to your experience. And if there are things that worry you that you haven't done before, that you haven't thought about, just internalize those things. And then I really like writing down whatever worries you. So if you're, concerned about being cold on summit night, for example, or if you're concerned about picking up a GI bug, being away from home for a long time, crossing a ladder, navigating the second step, whatever that is, get all of that out. And I think, this is sort of good to do in like brainstorming style and just like write it all down and look at it later. Maybe there's some things you're like, yeah, I actually have done that before or been in a similar situation that I can apply here. And it's not something that I'm overly concerned about. But once you have that list, it will serve you very well to have a plan for each of those things that worries you. And I like writing these things on note cards. So if your concern, for example, is that you're going to get cold on summit night, you might, for your solution might be that you're going to note that you're cold, like pay attention to it, acknowledge it, keep moving for 20 more minutes, and then reassess. And if you're still cold, then, put a warmer layer on or put a new hand warmer in your mitt or whatever it is. I think it's good to have a plan for those things because then if they do happen, they are not novel anymore. You've already thought about it and you sort of have this, menu or recipe for what you're going to do in order to get through those situations. I think it's also important, sort of in the same vein, to really know what your boundaries are. Like to know if I can't feel my toes, I'm turning around, and to commit to that. Or if I pick up a GI bug above Camp 3, I know I'm not going to recover and be strong enough to safely summit and be a good addition to the team. So I'm going to turn around. So thinking about boundaries is so critical because it keeps your beliefs and your actions in alignment. And especially in risky situations, if they're not in aligned, we can get ourselves into trouble. So I would add, just a brainstorming session about what your boundaries are. Maybe you've seen other people in the mountains. Like I remember on Denali, I might have told this story before, but I remember I was sort of low, like maybe Camp 2 on the mountain, having breakfast one morning, and through the window in the dining tent, I could see another girl descending, and her face was just sort of charred black with frostbite. And she was just dragging her ice axe behind her on the snow, like did not care anymore, didn't have the mental capacity to care anymore. And I remember thinking, and I couldn't at that point, like put it in terms of that's a boundary for me, but I remember thinking there is no way that I'm going to let myself get to that point on this mountain, and like committing to myself that I would stay true to that. It was a promise I made to myself. And then higher on the mountain, actually on summit day, I very stupidly, don't make this mistake, put a mitt on, and I did not put my hand through the leash. And then I took it off thinking it was, and it blew away. And I remember thinking, I have to turn around. And we got it back. We got the mitt back. But I remember thinking back to that promise I had made to myself, weeks prior, that I have to take care of myself. And if I ever can't do that, then it's the end of this climb for me. So boundaries, also very important in life as well as the mountains. Set your intention. So we talked about this a little bit already too, but I want to dig in a little bit deeper. As I'm coaching people, language is so important, so important. And as a coach, if I'm working with someone and I hear them say, if I climb Everest, if I summit Everest, if I summit Rainier, to me, that means that they have not clearly embodied this intention that they're going to summit. And it doesn't mean that you're becoming arrogant and overlooking obvious obstacles that might happen on the mountain, like weather or illness. But it means that as you're preparing for that climb, you have fully embodied and committed to that goal. So setting an intention to me, and I do this in my like personal life and, around business goals, for example, I don't just say, oh, I'm going to do that thing. It's like I commit to it, and my behavior, my language, everything is aligned with that intention. And if my thoughts especially are aligned with that intention, and if something starts to creep in that's counter to that, then I have to like examine that and flip it around, because when I'm committed, barring some like outrageous obstacle, I'm not going to give up on that goal. So intention, very important. And then the other thing that I encourage people to do is to start working on your gear early. I've coached some people who was like the night before they're leaving for Kathmandu, and they're just getting all their stuff out and starting to put it together. And so I make it a point always to give people time in their training plan to pack and to talk about gear. But you really can't start thinking about it too early, especially if you haven't climbed in the Himalaya before. Probably be using gear like 8,000 meter boots or maybe an ascender for the first time. So start collecting that gear early in the process. That also lets you take advantage of sales or taking the time to look for used gear if that's what you want to do. Be sure, of course, that you have worn those boots if they're new, plenty. And that, sometimes means wearing them outside in the summer. I guess if you're training for a climb in the fall, it would mean wearing them outside in the summer. If it's Everest, it would be wintertime that you're training. But be sure you wear them, even if it's on a treadmill, months before you go, so that you can work out your sock, insole, all that combination of stuff that's got to go in that boot, and to make sure you've got it super dialed so you're not suffering from blisters when you're on the mountain. I get a lot of questions on the subject of gear about using heated hand or foot warmers. And my tendency is to say no, because some of them are very fiddly. Like you've got to, tap a tiny little button with finger that's in a thick glove, or there's an app on your phone that you're supposed to be expected to use in order to change the setting or something. So I tend to say no, but I know a lot of people who absolutely swear by heated foot warmers or footbeds, for example. And I do think that there's newer, especially glove technology, that is getting better and is more geared towards high altitude climbing. The problem with some like heated glove liners is they're meant to like go watch a soccer game in. They're not meant to be used in a really, taxing environment in the mountains. So I think it's worth, investigating, thinking about it, but you must have a backup plan if that technology fails. What usually stops me from using them is that if you're using a heated glove and something happens and it doesn't work, the battery gets cold, even though it's rated for -40 or whatever, and you don't have a backup plan, then you are screwed. So make sure that you think through all those scenarios and you have a plan for keeping like the batteries charged, that you understand the user interface and you can engage it or use it even when you're wearing mitts or heavy gloves. As I said, it's just not optimal to push a tiny button to turn your boot warmer on when you've got a big glove or a mitt on. So that's my thoughts on heated hand and foot warmers, or electronic hand and foot warmers. Another gear tip is about zippers. So be sure in your pants specifically. So as you know, down suits, there are a couple of different designs for zippers. One is sort of like a rainbow across your butt, and then one zipper just goes across your crotch. So sort of from your back to just below your belly button. So choose whichever you like the best, but when nature calls, you need to make sure that all of your layers have that same zippering system, or having it just on the outer layer is not going to do you a lot of good. So once I figured out sort of what I thought my base layers on the bottom were going to be for Everest, I actually took those to a seamstress and had her add zippers to match the zippers on my down suit. For women, I think it's most convenient that those zippers are the ones that go from your, like the mid of your back all the way through your crotch and then just below your waist. And having those will make, peeing and pooping so much easier if you have to do it when you're on the move. While we're on this subject, for people who have periods, make sure you take some supplies with you, even if you're not expecting to have your period. I mean, if you're going to be on the mountain for a couple months, so you will at some point, most likely. I wish that there was some research to support this, but I've heard from many women, myself included, that our periods will start when we're climbing. I think it probably has something to do with our bodies just being under stress, but I don't really know the science behind that. But I do know that I got to high camp on K2. I used my pee bottle and there was my period, and it was not supposed to start. And that was not a very exciting surprise. But I had, things with me that I could use, and I took care of it and just moved on. But the point is to just be ready for anything, because you never know when it's going to happen. Another consideration for you is to think about how you're going to pass the time. So there's a lot of downtime in expedition climbing. And most of that downtime hopefully will be when you're at base camp. If it's not, it means you're probably stuck in a storm. So have your favorite device ready to go with books or movies that you love, or a series that you haven't been able to watch because you've been training for a year. I like to color at base camp because it's like super stress reducing for me, and I never take the time in my real life to sit down and color. So I'll be the one coloring at base camp. I've seen people work crossword puzzles. I've done Sudoku before. Just something that's like that you enjoy, that passes the time quickly for you. And think about things that you love to do that maybe you don't get to do in your normal life because you just, don't have the time. If reading is one of them, I recommend not reading non-climbing books, because I want to have an exit and escape from kind of the stress of being on an expedition. And so reading about like dogs or, something lighthearted like that is that for me. But I know some people like to read climbing books when they're climbing. The other thing to think about is team dynamics. This is a big subject. I guess I'll start by saying it's up to all of us to not be the jerk on the team. It's a shared experience. We're sharing, close quarters, tight spaces for multiple weeks, sometimes multiple months. And it's up to each of us to be a little more considerate and a little more adaptable and a little more accommodating. And if you need a break, like I've felt this way before, where I just needed to get away, like from my team, as long as you're at base camp on Everest, you'll have your own tent, most likely. So take that time and space that you need. I was talking to another client recently a female client who said that she often just gets like emotional sometimes. And I, really encourage her or anyone else just to, like, if you need to go cry it out, go cry it out. Like, that's what your tent is for. If you're, base camp on many mountains, there's plenty of space to like walk around. So take that time and space to make sure you're always contributing positively to your team. Have a plan for that. If things get, if you're really getting wound up about what someone else is doing, your partner snoring or being a slob or whatever, journaling is a great outlet for that. Now most of us have in-reach devices. So being able to like text somebody at home and just vent to them for a little bit is good. But think through less than ideal team dynamic situations and how you might get through those. I also think it's worth a dry run on your headgear. So it's a lot to manage: an oxygen mask, goggles, a knit cap, maybe a helmet, a hood. And I mean, I'm, smaller framed. And so fitting all of that gear onto this head was a bit of a challenge. And it was something that I made sure I had practiced and tested ahead of time at home, especially the oxygen mask part. I'm actually pretty shocked at the number of people who don't think about, I guess we just trust that whoever's providing the oxygen mask is providing one that's going to work for us, which 99% of the time it is. But I just felt like this was such a critical piece of gear that I wanted to have my own, and I wanted to, try it on and make sure that it fit well and that I could put it on, under my knit cap and with goggles on and with a hood on and all of those things. So I'm not saying you have to run out and buy one, but just you could also, I've had clients who have just like sort of fashioned one out of a surgical mask using the dimensions of Summit Oxygen's mask, which is the company that most outfitters now use. So you can go online and get the dimensions of their mask and then make like a triangular shaped piece that fits over your nose and mouth. So you can kind of get a feel for what that is like. But testing ahead of time, I think, is really important. And, practicing wearing it with goggles, a cap, a balaclava, maybe a helmet, a hood, getting all that stuff sorted out and the layers right is really important. I also recommend learning oxygen flow rates and times and writing them down on your glove before summit night, because you won't be able to do the math for sure. And then keeping track as best you can. It's kind of hard to keep track of time, but I've gotten into trouble before when I wasn't keeping track of time and my oxygen got low, or I had to turn it down lower than I really wanted it to preserve it. So double check those rates when you get to base camp. I think now there are higher flow rates than 4. I think somebody told me that 4 liters per minute. But make sure you know what those are, and then at each flow rate about how many hours of oxygen you should have. And then I always subtracted an hour just because I wanted to have a nice buffer. And then I wrote it on my glove in a Sharpie, so I didn't have to think about it. Nutrition and hydration, super critical. Again, something that I think a lot of people don't think of, and we'll dedicate a whole episode to nutrition with a performance nutritionist, because I think it's such a game changer. And so few mountain athletes think about nutrition. It's funny that like other more traditional sports, this is true with mindset. I think more traditional sports tend to, just naturally incorporate nutrition into their training plan. But for us as mountain athletes, for whatever reason, that doesn't seem to be true. So what I'll say here is make sure that you have a plan on Everest, that you don't get behind the calorie curve. And that includes when you're trekking. It includes when you're at base camp. Have a plan also for when you're climbing. I've heard of men losing 20 plus pounds on Everest. And unless you've got some sort of ongoing GI issue, I really don't think that it's necessary. I mean, you shouldn't put your body in a position to lose that much weight. So think about what you're eating at base camp. I think if I'm having trouble with appetite, which is pretty rare for me, I will think about food as fuel and sort of, eliminate any emotional context with the food of I don't like that, or I don't want to eat that, or it's not going to taste good, and just think of it as something I need to do in order to perform. And that helps me to eat it. Obviously, test all of your snacks ahead of time and be sure that you like them at sea level. If you can test them at elevation, that's phenomenal. But if you don't like something that, at sea level, if it's not super delicious for you, it's probably not going to taste that good to you at elevation either. I think it's also important to have some kind of calorie plan when you're climbing so that you're eating on a regular cadence. If you really are good at it, you'll know how many calories you're consuming each time you eat as well. And you'll look for really calorie dense foods that allow you to, sort of eat and get the most calories out of that one snack. I just think it's such a game changer when you've got that sort of worked into how you climb. For me on Everest, my sort of snack of choice was chocolate covered espresso beans, because they're delicious and they gave me a little bit of, caffeine boost. And I actually practiced before I got there. I just dumped all of the coffee beans in my pocket, and then I would practice grabbing them with my gloves on, pulling my oxygen mask, and then one by one feeding them into my mouth so that I got to eat with some regularity. And I don't remember the calories in one chocolate covered espresso bean. It's not a lot. But the point is that whatever it is that you're going to be eating, you've got it readily accessible so that you can grab it and it's so hard when you're at elevation, but you've got to just commit to getting those calories on board because your body can't perform without them. Also, please, I've heard people who've been advised to gain a bunch of weight before they go to Everest. Please don't do that. I understand the sort of the calculus of that. Like, you're probably going to lose weight, so you should gain more before you go, and then it will balance out. But what you gain if you have this last minute attempt to put weight on before you go, you're probably going to be gaining fat, which is not going to be much good for you at elevation. And you also have to carry as well as oxygenate every ounce on your frame. And so if I'm coaching you, I want everything that you're carrying to be functional so that it's going to help you get up and down the mountain, and putting on extra fat before you go isn't going to do that. And as I said, you've got to oxygenate it as well. So you're using oxygen that if it's not functional mass, you don't need to be using. So now these next few steps are really meant to give you, these are kind of emotional things. They're meant to give you a little bit of a boost when you need it. And for most people, that's before summit night, but as you're getting ready to climb to the summit. I have done this on several climbs, and it's been hugely beneficial for me, just to give me this positivity and sort of a little, cheerleading session from my friends before I went. So ask your friends or loved ones to record voice memos for you. I like the idea of writing a note too, but then you've got to carry the note with you, and ounces equal pounds and pounds equal pain. So you've probably got your phone with you. Have them create some sort of voice memo, and then don't listen to it until you need some motivation on the mountain. And my friends, before I went to Everest, some of them were hilarious and just made me laugh. And, it was a nice moment from all the seriousness of what I was about to do to have that moment of something funny. Some of them were really sweet and serious and motivational. And it really meant a lot to me to have that little extra encouragement when I needed it on the mountain. And I still have them. They're still on my phone. And then the other thing I think is really useful is to write a letter to yourself. A coach told me to do this many years ago, and I did before Everest, and I did before K2. And then I read that note when I was getting ready to leave the tent to start my summit attempt. And then I carried that note with me as well. So this should be super personal, of course. Nobody else has to see it unless you want them to. Mine forever still makes me emotional when I think about it. It should be something that reminds you of how strong you are, of how much you've overcome in your life, of how proud you are of yourself and your accomplishments. And let's face it, we don't often take the time to have this kind of a conversation with ourselves, but we can all look back at accomplishments that we didn't think we were ready for, and we somehow, or challenges that we didn't think we were ready for, and that we somehow got through them and we're stronger on the other side of them as a result. So take the time to write that down. I also like to write a letter, or it's easier often to make a video after I summit. I did this on K2 when I got back to Camp 2. And I'm so glad I did, because it really captured exactly the emotions that I had in that moment. I was obviously completely wiped and still hypoxic, but I still have that video, and it just really reminds me of what I had gone through, how important that summit was to me, and what I've accomplished. I like the idea of taking a selfie too once you get back to a safe camp, because they're freaking not funny. They're very scary. I posted, so against my partner's advice, I posted mine on Instagram once because it's not a very pretty photo. And someone commented and said, your eyes look like you're a refugee. Like, I've seen people in traumatic situations and their eyes have the same character as yours do in that selfie. And it's just really I hadn't thought about how much I had asked my body to do and sort of the level that I had taken it to in order to accomplish that goal. So take a selfie. It's a good sort of reminder of what you've accomplished. Okay, friends, that's Lisa's list of tips for Everest or really any other big peak. I would love if you have questions or feedback or other tips, please share those because we're all in this together. Thinking the most important thing I think is to take care of yourself on Everest. Number one, that includes, eating, drinking, speaking up, being honest. Be ready for the unexpected, even though you've trained for months and, you're committed to your climb. Things can happen that you don't expect. And that's why we train, so that we have the resilience to get through all of those situations. So if you're headed to the Himalaya or another big mountain this spring or summer, best of luck. And if you have questions or thoughts or other tips, please reach out. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If nothing else, you can say that you completed one thing today. All of the resources, products, and guest information that we shared can be found in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. You can also find out more about me and what I'm up to at lisaclimbs.com and at alpineathletics.net. And if you enjoyed this show, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Cheers!